One. Hi, welcome everybody. Today, this is a roundtable discussion held by the Economics and Finance Cluster at the Center for New Economic Studies. Today, we will be discussing about the Sri Lankan economic crisis and will focus on what caused it, the immediate and long-term impacts on the Sri Lankan economy, and if and how can they recover from this crisis. Before we start, I would like to introduce our panelists. Sanya and Mohan from Ashoka University, Gautam and Aniruddh from Jindal Global University. I, Hemang Sharma from Ashoka University, will be moderating this discussion today. So before we start, I would like to introduce the topic of our discussion. On 12th of April 2022, Sri Lanka's finance ministry declared that it will be defaulting on its entire $1 billion external debt as a last resort to prevent a further deterioration of the republic financial position. With reducing budget and increasing current account deficit, Sri Lankan economy found itself lost in an endless tunnel with no immediate glimmer of recovery. With lack of capital inflow and surging debt, Sri Lanka started printing excess money to pay it off. This decision backfired as it caused high inflation and deterioration of Sri Lankan rupee. Today, their foreign reserves are as low as $1.6 billion, which rendered them incapable of paying for imports. Hence, the fuel and food prices have dramatically increased, and the government had to enforce excessive power cuts. This this enraged the people of Sri Lanka as they just couldn't stand the brunt of this crisis, and they started protesting against their government. Amidst all this chaos, the Sri Lankan government is finding it really hard to stop this bleeding, which begs the question: how a country which used to perform better than most of its neighbor in terms of most of the economic indicators ended up experiencing one of the worst economic crises of the 21st century. What exactly brought Sri Lanka to a situation it is in today? I would request panelists to share their thoughts on this. Anyone who would like to speak first, please go ahead.
Yeah, I think the Sri Lankan economic crisis was basically threefold. Firstly, because of the COVID-19 pandemic and the and its effect on the tourism, because Sri Lankan economy is basically a tourism reliant economy. So firstly, that was a major effect. Then secondly, the rising oil prices around the world. So it had a very big effect on the economy. And thirdly, Sri Lankan government started doing a populist tax cut and giving tax concessions to all its citizens. So that was basically a very big that had a very big impact. And lastly, it was the ban on imports of chemical fertilizers, agriculture fertilizers by the Sri Lankan government. So I think these four major aspects were the basic uh, things that affected the Sri Lankan economy and led to the crisis.
Hemang, you're muted. I think another thing that needs to be really emphasized when talking about the cause of the crisis is especially the time period over which it took place. Several economic crises especially in the past 2 years, are the direct result of the pandemic and all the import, export, and trade problems and the tourism problems that happened because of it. But I feel like the Sri Lankan crisis specifically isn't one that happened because of the COVID-19 crisis, but it was kind of accelerated because of it. For the past 30, 40 years, Sri Lanka has been getting into quite a heavy amount of external debt with other nations and with monetary organizations such as the World Bank and so on. And the pandemic only accelerated that and didn't cause it. It just made the situation even worse. And yeah, as Aniruddh mentioned, the ban on chemical fertilizers and so on and so forth, and the implementation of an organic only food policy in the previous year, I feel like that had a twofold effect on um, speeding up the economic crisis, as well as making it extremely difficult for the citizens to cope within that economic crisis. Because due to the organic only situation, the costs of produce such as vegetables or rice or any crops shot up by a wild amount. So it made it extremely difficult for the citizens to manage with that as well. So yeah, I think the impact on the citizens is also something that needs to be emphasized.
I agree with what Mohan said about the time period aspect. So I also believe that it is not like that the COVID led to the crisis. I think the Sri Lankan successive governments have committed three of the major sins that have led to this economic disaster, such as heavy reliance on commercial borrowing to finance the budget deficit since mid 2000s, I believe, and their failure to widen their tax base. So the falling tax to GDP ratio is the proof of this. So it is due to the to which the failure to expand the tax base or reliance on indirect taxation led to the tax policy instability. And also the Sri Lankan government missed on the opportunities to grow and diversify their export market, which was really important for them to bring in their foreign exchange reserves. Also, a few critics believe that this economic mismanagement is created and sustained by a twin deficit. That's the budget shortfall alongside with the current account deficit. And this was signaled when country's national expenditure exceeded its national income. That, I mean, the production of credible goods and services was inadequate.
Gautam, would you like to share
Yeah,
your thoughts on this?
I wanted to add on to Mohan's point about the organic only thing. So if you've read about this, this was actually a really bad move taken by the president. And instead of consulting actual experts in this field, he consulted with Vandana Shiva, if you have heard of her. And if you've read her work or listened to her lectures, her views are more on fundamentalist lines against the use of genetically modified produce. There's really not much substance to it. And we must note, like as Indians, we must note it's the Green Revolution that fed a lot of our parents and grandparents. And this was as a result of the genetically modified technology. In an effort to take that out and return to more like archaic ways of agriculture, like this resulted by lack of foresight, basically. So it must be taken into account that fundamentalist arguments must be replaced with more scientific and technological evidence, rather than just saying just because this is genetically modified, it's bad. So yeah, that's important to note.
These all are really interesting points. Another point which I figure is relevant to the discussion is the Russian Ukraine conflict which is going on right now. That's the main reason why the fuel prices hiked up so much in Sri Lanka. And as we all know, demand for fuel is price inelastic. So with rising fuel prices, along with what Gautam just Gautam just told us about the hike in food prices due to bans on importing fertilizers. These all had a collective impact on the Sri Lankan citizens, as fuel and food, these are the basic necessities, something which is important for to sustain a decent livelihood, which is what I believe is the reason why Sri Lankan people started protesting. Plus, another point to note is that Sri Lanka had already had a history of conflict attached to itself, and the civil war ended in 2009, and since then they've been dependent on foreign help for their economy. Like Mohan suggested about the uh, pandemic hurting their tourism industry, which brings in a lot of money for them. This all resulted in a spiral down effect for Sri Lanka as they kept on falling in a bottomless pit as they kept on spending their foreign exchange reserves. They kept on depleting it. Their current account deficit kept on increasing, which uh, which uh, which I mean, which led them to the place they are right now. What is surprising for me is that how come Sri Lankan economists fail to predict this situation? Like pandemic lasted over 2 years. It did bring some uncertainty, but even before that, Sri Lanka had a history of increasing current account deficits on an annual basis. So with pandemic and all, I find it quite surprising how they weren't able to predict this crisis. So does anyone else have anything else to say?
I think they weren't able to predict this crisis because they act as a puppet for the Chinese government, and they have been taking so much loans from the Chinese government that they are asking for a debt restructuring from them. So I think the point is all of this that we have like encapsulated by what everyone has basically said leads to the thing that everything happened, and on top of that you are taking a lot of debt from the Chinese government because Sri Lanka being the most important part of the Belt and Road Initiative. So that basically shows that you are in such a deep trouble that after having a 35 billion debt, you are still asking for a debt restructuring, and accumulating on top of that 35 billion debt shows that you are in a deep trouble right now.
I couldn't agree more with you. And like adding on to your point, Aniruddh, another important thing to note here is that China invested in constructing ports. So they loaned money to Sri Lanka, but the money was invested in developing infrastructure, which had little to no, which had like very little return on its investment. So even though the loan came in, but there was no way for Sri Lanka to make money out of it, which again like forced them into the hands of China. Anyone else? Do you want to add something on to this? Okay, I'll take that as a no. This does so now let's move on to our next question. We we figured out what all caused what are the reasons of Sri Lanka plummeting in an economic crisis. So now I want to discuss what are the impacts of this crisis on the Sri Lankan economy and their citizens. Please feel free to go ahead and start speaking.
I believe there are an entire gamut of impacts because of this Sri Lankan crisis. Narrowing down on the key stakeholders, I would say for people, it had mainly three impacts. First, they had to wait in long lines to buy essential items like wheat and sunflower that were earlier imported by Sri Lanka. And because forex crisis led to acute shortages in the imported food. So, second one could be job losses that have become a common phenomenon in almost every household. And third, even the World Bank data indicates that the poor, based on a daily income of say $3.2 on an average, they have estimated to grow to like 11.7% in 2020. That is more than 500,000 people from 9.2% a year before the crisis. Also, I believe that the food inflation has soared to 25.7%, and and the crisis has now started impacting Indian exporters. So any disruption in Colombo port operations makes India the most vulnerable one to increase its costs and congestion issues. And so it is in India's interest to help Sri Lanka come out of the economic crisis in the short term, because thousands of containers that India sent to Sri Lanka, including its own consumption as well as the transshipment cargo, have been lying uncleared at the port because they don't have the funds to really transfer the containers between terminals. So it has started affecting India too. And the rupee is the world's worst performing currency right now, with foreign funds withdrawing a net $11 million from local stocks, according to the data compiled by the Bloomberg.
I think crises like these are also very interesting from a theoretical point of view, because they really show how economics and the economy as a whole is connected to other facets of society. So yeah, this is primarily an economic crisis, but it has extreme impacts on both the humanitarian situation as well as the political situation within the country. Sanya has very well explained most of the humanitarian problems, but I think what really needs to be stressed is that because of all these problems that's going on, there's a large amount of political unrest that's really bubbling up in the country. People are being forced, as Sanya said, to wait in long lines. There's a high amount of unemployment. Food, as both Aniruddh and I have said, is extremely expensive now because of the organic only policies. There's power cuts and blackouts across the country to save the very scarce fuel that there is. So there's political unrest and protests bubbling up among the citizens as well. And coming to the government, because most of this is a result of adverse policies taken by the current president Rajapaksa, there's also unrest brewing within the opposition of the government as well. In fact, the opposition side of the government has already brought up a draft bill to reform the current governance system. However, the problem is that even if this draft bill does pass with an adequate number of votes, Rajapaksa does have a history of military dominance within the region, because since he is the ruling president, he has power over the military and police. And he did also come to power as the president in Sri Lanka amidst the ethnic unrest that was taking place in Sri Lanka with respect to the Tamil Elams and so on and so forth. So most experts are of the opinion that this economic crisis is going to give way to a political unrest between the opposition and the current president, which in turn will be amidst a background of a huge humanitarian crisis. So yeah, apart from the very economic aspect, it seems like Sri Lanka is in for a pretty tough time coming ahead.
I think the impact has been very well summarized by both Sanya and Mohan. Only thing that I would like to add is that as we discussed about food shortages, even though there is fuel tankers or the fuel ships that are there on the port, but they don't have the money to even shift them from terminal to terminal. But the thing is that this is all impacting the citizens and the neighboring countries like India also, because many people are illegally immigrating to India. There have been like boats and all that stuff that are coming to India with a lot of people. So what is happening is that even though I believe that there is an economic crisis, people are suffering, but they are what this economic crisis is doing is that they are inviting people to another country to to take a refuge as such, to get more humane conditions that they are not getting in Sri Lanka. So I think this is uh, I mean, they have a point. They have a point that they want some humane conditions to live in, but I think it is negatively impacting the neighboring countries as well. Second point I would like to make is that the impact, if they are taking loans from IMF, debt restructuring loans from IMF, from China, and all that, I think my point, I'm restating my point, that it will not, it will, what will it do? It will pile up the debt itself. So I think it will not be of any benefit as such. So yeah, that's the two ones.
I really agree with Aniruddh's point that the debt is gonna pile up. What I believe happen is that once you start engaging with foreign debts, economies tends to get and the countries tend to get dependent on it. We can take the example of Afghanistan and USA here as well. USA kept on investing in Afghanistan, and their economy and their government became so dependent on it that when USA pulled its troops back and cut off all its funding, Afghanistan fell into Taliban's hand with little to no resistance at all. Secondly, another impact that I think is critical here is that by defaulting on foreign, like every country in a foreign exchange market, all countries have this option to default on their loans. If they can't, they don't really have to pay their loans. But what happens is that when you default on a loan, your reliability your your reliability your reliability among other countries fell fall. So this impacts the foreign direct investments that you could receive in future. Plus, investors, the domestic and foreign investors, tends to lose confidence in the economy. So by defaulting on your own loans, you are like totally eliminating one big component of the aggregate demand: investments and net even net imports. We can also talk about the fall in the financial gains that you receive from foreign direct investments. All this further results in their increased dependence on agencies like IMF and World Bank, which like from what Aniruddh said and from what I just said, I personally believe that right now Sri Lanka is moving towards a sustain towards a prolonged dependency on these agencies for the survival. Gautam, would you like to add something to that?
I actually had a different point to add on to like Mohan's point, wherein he said that the impact of this crisis is much more than just economic. Even though it is a primarily economic crisis, it is much more than just an economic effect. So like being a law student, I wanted to point out that when this whole economic and political crisis began, and it started to show its real colors, that it's not just a small thing. The entire cabinet, other than the president themselves, resigned. And a great jurist, Nani Palkhiwala, had said, it does not matter what is written in the constitution. What matters at the end of the day is the intent. What is in the mind of man. That constitution is a message of intent. What matters at the end of the day is what is in the mind of the man. So if humans themselves are not supporting the issue that is presented before them, there doesn't seem much hope for resurgence. That is what I wanted to point out.
That's a really interesting point. Does anyone else have anything to add to that? Okay. So so we've discussed some really interesting points so far about what caused the economic crisis in Sri Lanka and what are the impacts on its economy and on their citizens. So now we know that Sri Lanka is facing one of the worst crisis it has faced since its independence. So the question now we're going to discuss is, what's the way forward for Sri Lanka? Can they recover from this economic crisis? And if they can, what's going to be their way through it? So I would request panelists to share their thoughts on it.
Hemang, as you had pointed out in your very first speech, Sri Lanka has been well known for its extreme amount of social development before this crisis. And I feel like considering that past, it very much is possible to return to that level of growth and development with a certain number of steps. Something small but major that can be done is repealing the organic only policy that was implemented by the president, because that has sort of been a huge catalyst or a watershed moment for impacting the citizens and worsening the crisis for everyone. Now, the main motivation for implementing that policy in the first place was environmental factors, which is justifiable and noble. But I feel like the time period in which it was enacted, considering the fact that there was such an economic crisis brewing, implementing such a harsh policy might not have been, I mean, it definitely wasn't the best way to move forward. So repealing the policy and perhaps attempting to reduce the adverse environmental effects of chemical fertilizers and pesticides rather than banning them completely would be a more moderate and suitable way to go forward. Additionally, in order to try to repay all the debts that are stacking up, increasing exports is always a good way to go about that. And Sri Lanka is extremely well known around the world for its exports in textiles and garments and handicraft industries. And because handicrafts are something that are extremely unique, where competition from other countries won't really compare, because the handicrafts made by one country or even by one person is extremely different from that from another country. Competition, demand, and supply will go really well when increasing the production and export of unique handicrafted goods like this. So I think increasing the exports would be a reliable way to go about mitigating the negative effects of the crisis.
Adding into the bargain, I would say that Sri Lanka has been a victim of its own like crumbling and political institutions. So the trifecta of sins that I mentioned in my first answer, I believe that has brought it to the brink of default and it could undo the decades of progress that Sri Lanka has done till now. So to prevent that, they should really concentrate on implementing a coherent strategy or strategic efforts towards maintaining the stability at a macroeconomic level and sustaining their debt while protecting the groups that are vulnerable. So by reducing poverty through strengthened and well targeted social safety nets, or promoting spatial transformation through investment in human capital formation, that may be in the form of health, education, or even social protection. And I believe setting few goals and prioritizing few actions can serve as an impetus to the economic transformation. So the sector should strive for direct efforts for transformation of the farmers itself, so that they can lead to value generation by implementing a mix of programs that support the adoption of climate smart technologies or expand their access to the value chains. And they can even avoid diversification into low return activities, because it will not help in increasing the income growth. And strategic investment should be encouraged in the tourism sector, as it would supplement the rural income growth, because it leads to job creation for both the low skilled and the vulnerable groups. And improving on the quality of jobs being offered can also ensure social security nets being in place. That's what I think.
I think the way forward is basically an independent central bank for Sri Lanka. So basically, they all the tax cuts that they have done for the past 4-5 years. That so they have to accumulate those funds. So they have to increase the policy rates. And secondly, even though I don't believe that IMF restructuring is the way forward, but I think a deep crisis like this, they need to go somewhere. They need to seek some help, and Chinese government is basically not a favorable outcome for them. So I think they should go for IMF restructuring instead. And third point is basically to increase access to non-farm jobs. Basically, as I mentioned in my first question, that Sri Lankan economy is a tourism reliant economy. Basically, all these people from around the world come there look at all these things there in Sri Lanka. So I think they should boost their tourism expand. They should do a tourism expansion kind of stuff, so that I think that will be a better suited way forward for Sri Lanka. That's all. Thanks.
Gautam, would you like to add on?
Not really right now.
Okay, so I had one point in mind. What Mohan and Soumya suggested. These ideas, these suggestions, they're only possible in long run. This is the issue which, like, all nations which suffer from an economic crisis face. Like, in the long run, you have the potential to improve your to like recover from the crisis. But what about the immediate situation? How can you recover from that? That's where the bailout packages from IMF and World Banks come in. So, like Aniruddh said, it's not the favorable situation, but they have to make use of these bailout packages that IMF is offering them. The important thing for to keep in mind for Sri Lankan economists and their central bank is that they can use these bailout packages to like clear off their external debt and all, but they need to be very careful with it. They cannot they they need to invest this money in in uh, in activities which is going to yield greater returns to them in future. Because if they don't, they'll again, just like I said earlier, they'll their dependency on foreign support will increase, which is gonna which is not going to be really favorable for Sri Lanka. So right now they are in a very delicate situation, and honestly, on like a short term notice, on a in a short term period, their citizens and their economy is going to suffer. There's nothing that anyone can do about it. But the way the means that our panelists has suggested right now, they need to be very careful with their bailout packages and keep investing in other activities like tourism and all. Does anyone else have anything to say or add to this? Okay, so I'll take that as a no. Thank you all for joining in today. I really liked this discussion. I hope you all enjoyed as well. Thank you and good night. Bye.
Thank you.
Bye bye.